This video will be revising the key features of the Christian beliefs and teachings for AQA Religious Studies A. So let's have a look at what is in this part of the specification. So you've got two parts to this. There'll be two separate videos, one on key beliefs and then the other on Jesus Christ and salvation. So this video is going to cover the key beliefs part. So we're going to have a look at the idea of the nature of God, different Christian beliefs about creation, and then different beliefs about the afterlife as well. We're going to start by having a look at the nature of God. So within Christianity, you'll find there are lots of different characteristics associated with God, and there are many of these, but you only need to know three in particular. So you need to know the idea of omnipotence, which is meaning all-powerful, and this is the idea that God, who is the creator, links the idea of miracles, is an all-powerful being. The second one is the idea of benevolence, or being all-loving, and this links in the Christian idea of God to Jesus' death and the sacrifice there, and also to the idea of prayer. So people will pray to God as a loving God. And then the third and final one that you need to know is the idea of God being just. And this is the idea that God is fair and will ensure that justice is maintained within the world. And this links very closely to the idea of life after death. It also links the idea of suffering and the idea of judgment. Now, moving on from these characteristics, one of the ways that these characteristics have led to debate and discussion within Christianity is the idea of the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil can be quite easily summed up by the sentence that you can see on the screen here. So, if God is all-powerful and is loving, then why does evil exist? That is the nature of the problem of evil. Why is evil a thing? If God is able to stop suffering, so God being all-powerful, and God would want to stop suffering because God is all-loving, why does it still exist? Now, there have been a number of different responses to this from within Christianity. So there are a few on the screen that you can see here. So one is to look towards the idea of the devil or Satan as the source of evil. There is another connection to that with the idea of original sin, which we will look at a little bit later. Then you have got the suggestion that evil and suffering helps people to become more godlike. It helps their soul to develop and to improve. So it has a purpose. It is a reason why suffering exists. And then a minority view is that suffering is a form of punishment, perhaps for sin and so on. So within that, it's also important to note that some Christians will make a distinction within their explanations between moral evil, which is evil that comes from individuals, from people, from groups of people, and natural evil, which is something that's found in nature. So, for example, things like volcanoes or earthquakes. So this distinction might influence the explanation that they give. We're now going to move on to have a look at another aspect of the nature of God, which is the belief in the Trinity. And this is a really core belief within Christianity. So the belief in the Trinity suggests that God has three aspects. There's one God with three different aspects that Christians might recognise. So these three aspects are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, within that, you've got those kind of key features of those. So the Father is the idea of God being transcendent, so outside of time and space, being all-powerful, very much linked to the idea of creation. With the Son, we're particularly linking that to Jesus, so God incarnate meaning making flesh. And this aspect of God is seen as very much more immanent, so part of the world and personal. And then thirdly, with the Holy Spirit, again, linking more to the immanence of God, so God being within the world and connecting to that. And this is viewed as the aspect of God that links to the way that God might inspire people to act properly in the world today. If we're looking at a record of where these beliefs might come from, one of the key documents that describes these beliefs in the Trinity is the Nicene Creed. So you can refer to that if you are talking about the Trinity. So another way to describe the Trinity is found here on the screen. This is from David Cunningham, who describes the Trinity or gives an analogy of a river. So the idea that there's a source, there might be a spring, and then that moves into the water, but they are all connected. They're all one thing, but have different aspects to them. Another analogy given is often that of water. So the idea that H2O is still H2O, whether it's found in the form of water or ice or steam. So that's another analogy people might use. Now, it's important to note that most Christians do believe in the Trinity. However, there are groups of people who do not. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses would argue that Jesus was a separate being created by God, as opposed to being an aspect in the form of the Trinity. So that's an interesting, different view to know about. Moving forward, we're going to have a look at creation next. So there are different creation accounts and we're going to have a look at these in turn. It's important to note that how these creation accounts are interpreted varies widely within Christianity. Let's start with Genesis 1 to 2, where we find the first creation account. So mainly found in Genesis 1 and just a few lines of Genesis 2. This account is commonly known as the 7 days of creation or the 6 days of creation account. And it tells God creating the universe over a series of 6 days and then resting on the 7th. And you find within this account a number of significant ideas. For example, humans being created in God's image and being told to rule over the other creatures. So this is really significant for some of the ideas to do with the environment, to do with sanctity of life and so on. Then following on from that, in Genesis 2 to 3, we then find the creation account linked to Adam and Eve. So this tells of God creating Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And then we have the account of Eve being tempted by the serpent to eat from the tree of knowledge, where they were told not to eat from. When they eat the fruit, they realise the truth about God and evil, and Adam and Eve are then banished from the garden. Now, this event is particularly significant because some Christians believe that this is the point where sin enters the world, this idea of original sin. So this event is sometimes known as the fall. It's the point where evil and suffering enters through original sin. So when we look at these accounts, it's important to note, as I said previously, that there are lots of different interpretations of these. So some Christians might take more of a literalist view or a creationist view, where they view the Genesis account as a literal explanation of how the world began. But many would argue that these stories are more myths, in the sense that they do contain truth, but they shouldn't be regarded as a set factual scientific account of what happened. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we also find people who would argue that these accounts are just stories. They're meant to be poetic and would have been passed on to people through word of mouth, and were more about making sense of the world around them for those people who were experiencing these stories, as opposed to giving any kind of factual account of creation. There are also within that a few other ideas. So some Christians might believe in theistic evolution. This is the idea that God uses processes such as the Big Bang and evolution, so some of the perhaps more scientifically accepted ideas, to then create. And you've also got some Christians who believe in intelligent design. And this is the idea that the world seems so complex, so perfectly designed, there must be a designer behind it, and that designer is God. So that links to perhaps some of the ideas to do with the design argument as well. Now, the last thing we're going to have a look at with regards to creation is the role of the Word and the Spirit. And this is mentioned on the specification, so it's really important that you're able to explain what these are. So if we start with Genesis 1 to 3, and this is one of the references on the specification, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Now, with this quote, many Christians see this as pointing towards the Holy Spirit, and they view the Holy Spirit as being present in creation, and many have connected this with the idea of the Holy Spirit helping to transform the chaos of the material of the world into some kind of order. So that's where some people see the role of the Holy Spirit being there at creation. And then linked to that, in John 1:1, so one of the books of the Gospel, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." And again, this idea of the Word is very much connected with Jesus, because in the Gospel, it later goes on to connect the Word with Jesus. And so many Christians will view this as signposting that Jesus was also present at creation, and signposting towards that idea of the Trinity again in creation. So let's go on to the last part of this half of the belief section. So the last part we need to have a look at is the idea of life after death. So common within nearly all forms of Christianity is a belief in resurrection. This is the idea that in some form, the dead will be restored to some form of life. And this, of course, is very much connected with the idea of Jesus being resurrected. I think it's fair to say that nearly all Christians do believe in some form of life after death. Most would argue this also involves some form of judgment and people being judged based on how they lived their life, whether they were a good person, but also perhaps whether they followed the teachings of Jesus. Now, from that, you find the idea of heaven and hell. So the good going to heaven, the bad going to hell. And also you find within Roman Catholicism the idea of purgatory, which is a place that is not eternal, so it's temporal, a chance that people have the kind of opportunity to perhaps reduce some of the sin they have gained during their life. It's important to note that some Christians do not believe that heaven and hell are physical places, however others do. It really depends. There are a wide variety of different interpretations. So these beliefs in life after death are particularly significant in terms of how people might behave and act. So one of the Bible stories that you might link to this belief is the idea of the sheep and the goats, which explains that people might be judged based on how they treated others, how they cared for others and looked after others. And so this might have a really big impact on how people live their life. Perhaps they might try and be a better person because they believe in the afterlife, that will have a positive impact on whether they go to heaven or hell. Another reason why beliefs about the afterlife are particularly significant is because it gives people hope that their loved ones who perhaps might have passed away have gone on to somewhere positive. And also thirdly, it links the idea of Jesus' resurrection and ascension, so it ties those beliefs together, which is obviously another fundamental aspect of Christianity. So that's some of the reasons why these beliefs are particularly significant. So looking back at the specification, we have covered the first half of the specification content. We've looked at the idea of nature of God, we've looked at different beliefs about creation, and we've also had a look at the beliefs about the afterlife and their importance.